All right, welcome back to another episode of Fire Apparatus Emergency Equipment, the Apparatus Workshop podcast. I'm Nick Wilbur, joined with me as always, Win Slough. Today's going to be an interesting one. We had talked about a lot of things, what we're going to talk about this year, and this year we kind of threw this in one in there, a little ad hoc because I think we've talked about a lot of different podcasts. We've kind of circled around the wagon here with some of these topics, and I think it deserves a deep dive. I think there's a lot of people out there that are in the middle of trying to sign contract. A lot of people have signed contract or in that long waiting line to get a fire truck or even just to go to pre-engineering. So what we're going to talk about today are some things that you can ask for from the manufacturer, and then also pre-engineering and final inspection. As Tom Shan has said before on here, rules of the road. So setting the stage for pre-engineering and final inspection. We've kind of mentioned things here or there, and we want to get everything together in one podcast. So to kick it off, I'll kind of kick it to Win. And one of the things that we had talked about a lot was turning radiuses and the things that go into turning radiuses and more maneuverability. People say we're going to shorten a rig or we're going to improve the wheelbase. But as I go around teaching or asking questions or we talk to clients, we kind of find out that the wheelbase and length are like big ones that everyone knows. But what are other things that you want to understand about your vehicle when it comes to turning radius? And then how can we figure out if we're improving turning radius or not?
Yeah, I think a couple before we even jump into that. I think, like you said, there are things that you want to see in that process, and even things that, and we're going to talk, I think, a little bit about final inspection stuff here towards the end. But you have to have an idea of what you want to see at the beginning of this process, because for a lot of it, it costs money, and if it's not in your, when I know we talked about this before, if it's not in that initial bid or that boilerplate when you get to final inspection or pre-con, there may be things that you are limited in doing because you didn't think far enough ahead, to request them. So we'll talk about some of them, but I think that you're requesting all of these things. You need to think about it up front so that it is kind of baked into the cost of that fire truck from the beginning and not an additional add-on. Uh, but in the turning radiuses, we talk about wheelbase and everything, but sometimes we forget that things that we do on top of the wheelbase can affect that turn. If we put a 24-inch bumper on the front of this fire truck or even bigger, then that's going to affect the overall curb to curb turning radius of the fire truck, not just the wheelbase. Not that, and the same thing if our overhang is increased or we put a longer than necessary tailboard, and there is a magic number for tailboards depending on what you're doing, but if you go over, then that's going to increase it. If you go under, then you're just going to have a hard time standing on it. It makes it unsafe. Um, so it's kind of having that happy medium and understanding, all of that. What's curb to curb? What's axle to axle? What's the inside turn radius? A lot of manufacturers will only give you a right turn radius. So is the turning radius going to the left different? And sometimes it is. So you want to make sure that based on the turning radius or the axle setup that you pick, axle, tires, suspension setup, and anything else, front intake, things like that, and even potentially the new exhaust system that we think is probably going to extend the wheelbase of some fire trucks. All of that has to be kind of looked at, and then you have to take it and compare it to your first due. And I think that's a big thing a lot of people forget too is comparing that to your first due.
I think so. One thing you can ask for is that turning radius report. And, things that I think about and that are crucial is that tail overhang because it affects two things. One, it can affect your turning radius report and your turning radius, how well the vehicle is going to turn, but it also affects your angle of approach and departure. So that's just a maneuverability thing on both sides. It might not be, I can go and make a wheelbase 30 inches shorter on a fire truck, but between my weight and balance of where my weight's going to be and how my vehicle is going to ride, that's going to be affected. The overhang in the back and how it's going to swing out, that could be a problem in tight areas, hitting cars and light poles and things like that. And then, on the other side is that angle of approach and departure, getting into some of these, over these culverts or drainage, systems where you're entering a driveway or a business or something else, or even the firehouse. A lot of firehouses have pretty steep angles of approach and departure. So turning radius report's huge, and like Wynn said, making sure it's both directions. One thing we haven't mentioned yet, I don't think, is cramp angle, right? So how far that wheel can actually turn. So we've seen people go with shorter wheelbases, but actually increase weight on the front axle or change the way that they axle the rig and limit their cramp angle now. So now their vehicle can't turn, the wheel itself cannot turn as far as it could before. And so, although we've shortened the wheelbase, we don't actually have a better turning vehicle. So, it's very important to look at the entire picture. Every podcast we say weight things, and weight has a say in this, whole thing as well too. We've had vehicles that were shipped and delivered and spec'd and engineered overweight because the wheelbase was not the correct wheelbase for the vehicle. So I think that we can't get stuck in the single mindset of smaller wheelbase, more maneuverable. Let's go hit print. We're going to buy this fire truck. We have to look at that whole thing. And what that turning radius report does is allows you to compare vehicle to vehicle too, so you can see what the curb to curb is. I know, and you might have a better idea. In Arlington, we use some of those reports for builders. They send them out to people that are building mid rises, high rises, if they want to have a circle in the front of their building for like a drop off or a hotel or something like that, we actually give them the turning radius report, and that is the dimensions they need to build that circle to so that our ladder trucks can get access, either making the entire circle length around or at least getting access to the front side of the building through these turns that they put in there. And so those dimensions kind of help even on the fire engineering side or engineering side of buildings and the approval process. So I think there's a lot, having those reports around. That's a more of an apples to apples comparison of what this vehicle is going to do in your district. And if you have a vehicle now today, you can ask for it and then figure out what your new vehicle or the next vehicle might need to be either better or the same. And then as you make decisions on the rig, you can go back to that report to make sure that you're staying in those that guardrail, that barrier, so you're not going to get a vehicle that's less maneuverable for your district. I think that's probably one of the more important ones out there that you can get, and that I don't think a lot of people ask for. And it's not standard, right? I don't even think anybody's doing it really standard across the board unless you ask for it.
Yeah, I think it definitely has to be asked for. It may show up in somebody's um, approval package as being in there, but it's something that's definitely easy to ask for, and in an entirety can be run in a couple hours. I think there's two things that you said in there that are two different things. Obviously, the turn radius reports one, but then the angle of approach and departure is a separate thing, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other thing you need to pay attention to is at what speed is that turn radius report taken at? Is it at what is the miles an hour? Does the speed that you are taking that turn increase the turn radius? And it really does. It increases it, pretty drastically, depending a foot or so more, depending on that speed that you're taking that turn. So factor that into that too, and make sure that you understand what speed that turn radius report is being kind of given at. And then you talk about angles of approach and departure. NFPA minimum is 8, and that's all they're going to list on most drawings is 8. If you would actually put a protractor or whatever, I'm not a math magician here, whatever math major, but if you're to put something, whatever that tool is on there and see it, that angle of approach is actually greater. Um, but NFPA or 8 degrees is a minimum. So if you have something that you definitely need over 8, you want to tell them that up front. Hey, we need a 10-degree plus or a 12-degree angle of approach, and that could change the way that you're able to do things on your front bumper, whether it's having to have a raised trough versus a dropped in trough. Um, Maybe the tow hooks don't. I mean, and you want the tow hooks to be the lowest part of your truck, so you're not doing damage to the bumper or trays. But maybe there are other things that you have to think about doing. But if you don't tell them what that is, then they are not going to give you, what you want. And you can ask. You should want to ask up front. Hey, I want the actual angle approach of this fire truck listed. I don't know what I need yet, but I want the actual angle approach. But if you have those issues of culverts or even pulling out of your firehouse could potentially be an issue. Um, we ran into that at work a couple places where they had to rebuild the ramps because the fuel tanks were dragging on the back ramps or on the front ramps as we pulled out and backed in. So, again, having those numbers or knowing where those issues are and giving them to your builder and saying, hey, these are the things that we need to be careful with. Um, you know, what can we do? And I guess kind of to build off that, I have one I'm looking at here it's a tunnel diagram for a tunnel that's in one of the fire companies that we work with their first due, and they were concerned with hey, what size fire truck can we fit under here? And basically, what it came out is there's no fire truck being built today that you can fit under that tunnel. So that they go into it thinking, oh yeah, we want to fit through this tunnel, and then you get told, all right, well we can't do that. Or again, maybe it puts that height limitation on um, your tunnel to where a ladder truck under 11 or under 12 feet is necessary versus a majority of them that are over 12 feet. Does that drive me? How important is it? Does it drive me into a mid mount tower? Does it drive me into a tiller truck potentially? Or do I need to go with a smaller tire, a different front axle that allows me to get to where I will need to do it? It helps the builders understand based on what's important in your first do. It helps them understand how to build that truck to fit your needs.
I think the big thing you said there is just knowing those numbers, right? And if you have for us, at work, you had an engine that pulled out, and you look at the spec drawing, it's 8 degree NFPA minimum. The next engine we get, we add, let's say, 10 more gallons of fuel. It wasn't that simple. It was a lot bigger of a change that we did. But let's simplify it and just say we added 10 more gallons of fuel into the fuel tank because XYZ, we're running more calls, fuel pumps change, whatever it is, and we still look at the next drawing now, this new fire truck, and it still says 8 degree minimum. Nothing has quote unquote changed to that vehicle. So hey, everyone thinks, in the committee, like, hey, we're still 8 degrees, we're good. Well, that ramp requires 9 degrees of clearance.
Right.
The other engine was 11, and now we're at 8.5, but it still showed that 8 degrees. So just knowing those numbers and then understanding that that is a change. Could be good, bad, might not change a thing, right? But knowing that those dimensions or those numbers are changing is important. You're not going to know every single area of your first due. You're not going to know all of these things and where it's going to be able to fit and not, right off the bat. But if you see a change, you can then start kind of targeting that. Hey, I know that I had 11 degree angle of departure. Now I have a 9.5. A degree and a half doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a pretty significant thing. So now that's going to make me look and say, hey, is this a good idea or not? That number's changed, and now we can have an informed conversation. Can you still miss stuff? Absolutely, right? That's going to happen. You're not going to hit 1,000%. You might go and say, hey, that we don't want to lose that degree and a half, and go back to 11, and really that could have changed nothing. But again, it's just that little marker there to throw up a flag so that that conversation happens. The last thing you want to do is not even know about it. The fire truck's backing in, and now we have a problem. So
Right.
anything that we can do to help ourselves
Yeah,
there is going to be.
and those changes could be stuff that you made, or even manufacturing changes that occurred between your last build and this build. That and even if you're buying the exact same fire truck, it could be a small change that change that little bit, and now it's going to affect it. So if you're not asking for that actual angle approach and departure, then you don't know the true dimensions of your fire truck. And again, will this fire truck work in my firehouse? You might have a funky angle. Again, like we talked about coming off the ramp. I know when here at home when we built our ladder truck, we sent drawings of like engineered drawings of our front ramp because when you come out of the one bay of the firehouse, the ramp angles down. If I get my hand up, kind of. it goes down and then to the left as well, and then you take a really really sharp turn um, to go to the south, I guess southeast side of our fire district, and the old ladder truck wouldn't even make the turn. Like you had to stop and back up and then go. Then our new ladder truck in the same bay makes that turn, but we had to do again because of bay door heights and things like that. We had to do a whole bunch of other stuff along with sending those diagrams in and having the manufacturer kind of engineer the fire truck to make those turns and do what we needed to do and fit our firehouse.
I think that kind of goes back, there's been a lot of podcasts out there and about program rigs or having that stock unit, and there's a lot of value there, and I don't want to take away from that. And people are saying that custom rigs are dead and people are doing all these crazy things, and I think the word custom is kind of being thrown around there like it's this huge gold leaf thing, but really customization can be as simple as that. You just change where the fuel tank's located by 8 inches, put it as a 60 instead of a 65 gallon fuel tank, and now you change the tires out in the back, and those quote unquote customizations now allow you to make a turn in your first due out of your firehouse that you make every single day,
Right.
right? Going to a part of your area that might be the busiest part of your area. And that's the customization that everyone's kind of poo pooing a little bit. I'm not saying everyone is, but it's a huge point of contention in the fire service now, and it's just very interesting because I think there's a lot of room for these minor tweaks that have such huge differences and such huge impacts for the fire department. If you're in, let's say, the FDNY, right, like big city where there's just streets and there's really no bridges or anything that you have to go over or underneath, then that's fine, right? I mean, some of the old school firehouses pose a challenge, right? But if you have the same, pretty easy dimensions, then a custom or a program rig could be the rig for you. But unfortunately, across the country, that's not the case everywhere. And you can still customize, but
I just wrote that in an article that it feels like custom is the you know taking on the same connotation of the word aggressive in the early 2000s, where it's a bad thing, and it's not. Custom doesn't necessarily mean uh, black ladders and gold leaf and every light in the world. Custom means made for your first due, and that's what becomes important: is what do you need for your first due? And yeah, unfortunately, that does make it a custom fire truck, and that's why they'll never go away. And you're right. Program trucks or demo trucks, do have a place, obviously, in an emergency if you need to get one now or today. But they're gonna hamper something somewhere down the road because it's not built to last. It's not necessarily built for your first due. So you are giving something up in that sense. And that's not to say that it's not going to work perfectly fine for what you needed to do. It's just you need to look at what you needed to do for your first due and make sure that it is going to fit your needs. Because in the end, it could end up just costing you more money than waiting and building the fire truck that you need.
so as we talk about different things we can ask for, I kind of wrote a couple of things down that I can think of in my exposure, and we're going to start off with the most exciting and exhilarating part. The kind of the ladder storage area. So I remember going through with College Park's truck. We had pretty much ladder tunnel drawings done, and we even side stacked ladders, so there was drawings done for that as well, separate from the main spec drawing. That was something that we specifically asked for, right? We want to look at, you have the spec drawing, everyone looks at it, it's great. I'll get on my soapbox again for 2 seconds. If you look at most manufacturers posting ladder trucks out there, they'll tell you if it's a quint, the pump size, the tank size, they'll tell you how much supply line's on there. But I don't know that there's any posts out there, very few, that talk about what the ground ladders are or even the complement, right? Just saying it has the NFPA minimum ground ladders. Some people do that. Some people don't mention ground ladders at all, right? And for me, that's my thing I like to look at. So it's interesting. You have to go through so many hurdles just to find out what ground ladders some of these ladder trucks are carrying. But for us, it was so important that we had separate drawings done and pulled out so that you could just see the ladder tunnel. and we could try using every inch of space possible, depending on where the cables and stuff are coming down, the controls for the aerial through the torque box. Um, any of those clearance issues there, the actual ladder tunnel itself, side to side, up and down, what dimensions we had to work with. So I think that one was a pretty good one to look at. And then another thing with ladder trucks specifically was the aerial load analysis. So there was, as we put tools and things out on there. So we have our 6 foot or 8 foot hook and our axe that are out on the tip of the aerial. Well, they do a load analysis, making sure that the tools that you're going to put out there don't affect the load chart at all, and you're within the allotment that they talk about. So if you just have standard complement of stuff out there and nothing changes, then you probably don't need that. But if you're looking to put a set of irons and an 8 foot hook and a saw now mounted out at the end of your aerial or your bucket, then you didn't do that before. That might be something that you want to look at to make sure that you're not altering any of the other parts of the tip loading or the load chart, and to see how much space you have left, because you might want to do something in the future. So it might be something that might be nice to have.
Yeah, that that load chart for the aerial, that it's very important that you tell them exactly what you want to put out there, because it's the same thing as a weight review. If you plan on doing anything to that ladder truck that you don't advise them, you could very well technically overload the ladder and void any part of your warranty, or take the liability off of, whatever, if there's an issue. And, it's important because everything that's on that ladder, from the rung lights to the tip lights, the waterway, even the lights at the base of the aerial, the tracking lights, are going to affect the overall weight of that ladder all the way up to the top. So you need to make sure that you say, we're going to keep a 6 foot hook up there. We're going to keep a halogen bar, a pig, or an axe, or whatever we're going to keep up there. Your saw boxes, if you put um, Stokes baskets up there for whatever reason, um, all of that stuff factors into the weight that's available. And you might put the minimum equipment up there, but the aerial might already be, or very close to being, overloaded. And you say, oh, 5 years down the road, you say, oh, you know what, we need an axe and a Halligan up there, and you add it, and now you've voided whatever's left of the warranty, and again, putting the liability back on yourself, because you've overweighted that aerial at this point. Um, so again, it's important to understand, like, all of that stuff is added, or figured into that, as you start to add stuff to your aerial, or the tip of the aerial, that at the end of the day is probably only going to make your operations a lot harder, because now you can't see, you can't get on it, you can't get off of it. Um, it becomes an issue. So you got to think about all that, even again in the beginning. And,
Yeah, that's why Wynn was laughing. I was shaking my head no. And you start talking about Stokes baskets and stuff. I mean, I get it, trying to put all this stuff on there, and there's quote unquote easier spots or whatever. But if you are going to do it, make sure it's not on the turntable side where you're operating the aerial, so it doesn't block your line of sight. But I would just not do it at all. Right, ladders on the ladder board are probably as far as I would go as far as limiting your site and things like that. But again, specifying where that is. We ran into that issue in Arlington where two ladder trucks going down the line, one after the other, and one had the ladder, the 16-foot ladder, mounted on the officer side. One had it mounted on the driver's side, and we never specified, so they just put it wherever they felt like they should put it. And so obviously we changed it so they're both on the officer side because our operating pedestal is on the driver's side. So we didn't want to limit our visibility for our operator. So we made that change, and now future specs have it has to be on the officer side because we never specified. So that was kind of back on us a little bit.
yeah, and again, back to the ladder tunnel. It's. I mean, if you're designing this thing to be a ladder truck, then we want to figure out the most advantageous way to get what we want in it. And again, the right ladders for our first due um, become very, very important. And how can we do it? Do we need to mix manufacturers? Do we need to do whatever? Um, but having that ability to have that drawing and say, hey, this is what can fit in here. Do you need 14 pipe poles in the back of your ladder truck for the four people that are riding it? Or can I put another 16 in there? So again, it becomes very important to have these conversations with your dealer. And Listen, a lot of the stuff that we talk about, unfortunately, they're not doing this for free. Um, there are certain parts of it that are built into the fire truck, and hopefully your dealer is and your manufacturer is willing to do all of this stuff for you. Some of this stuff you do have to pay for. Like Nick talked about ladder tunnel drawings. And uh, there are certain manufacturers where you have to pay to even see what your pump panel looks like. If you want a pump panel drawing with your initial set of documents, you have to pay for that. So again, if you're not asking for it, and then you get there and say, "Well, why does my pump panel look like this?" and they say, "Well, the new engineer that came out thought this was the best layout for your pump panel." Well, when did he go to a fire list? Oh, he just graduated from college. He's not a firefighter. Well, you're kind of in trouble there. So you have to be able to specify that and know that that's what you want to see, and then understand that you hopefully will have the ability to make changes to that pump panel. One of the other things that you kind of want to call out for in the beginning, and this is something that a lot of people don't think of, is really the number of trips that you want to take is one of those things that you obviously you have to talk about it. It's going to cost somebody money. But a lot of people just bury that in the cost of their fire truck. One of the things you want to call out for, or I'm a big fan of calling out for, is what is this going to cost me per person? And that way I can take that, I can know that number, and I can do two things with that number. I can take that number out of the cost of my fire truck because, yes, it is going to be factored into that cost, but I can at least know that, if I want to take 10 people, I mean, you're going to look at take 10 to 12,000 to 15,000 extra dollars per trip if that's what you want to do, right? So if you don't understand that, they're just going to bake that in and be like, all right, you want to take 12 people? Sure, we don't care. We'll take 12 people out there. You're going to pay for it. So knowing that lets you understand what that cost is, and then you can make the decision. Hey, we can do this cheaper if we book the travel. And a lot of times it depends on what you're going to get out there, what's included in the cost of that trip. Is dinners or lunches or meals included, or is the fire department responsible for that? Again, you want to have that understanding, and that's one of those things that it's just kind of there, but you want to know kind of what you're paying for in that case. And again, that warranty items, things that are going to be additional on top of the cost of the fire truck, you want to ask for to kind of be a little bit separate so that you can kind of break those down. Yeah, this truck is costing me this, but we have a $2,000 extra paint warranty, or a extra, we bought an extra year of warranty coverage for $10,000 or whatever they charge you. You can still go back and say, hey, community, this is what the fire truck costs us. These are the ancillary numbers on top of it that we have to pay to get this done. And again, if you go to your board and say, hey, it's going to cost me $15,000 to take the whole committee, they might say, nah, listen, you can take 5 people from your committee. We're going to cut that cost in half. So again, understanding what that's costing you becomes kind of important.
And it's per trip, right? So you have, let's say, 15 people in your that are going to go. That's 5 people for 3 trips: pre-engineering, midpoint, and final inspection. You might think that's too expensive, but maybe we take 5 people out now. We just do a pre-engineering and a final inspection trip, and don't do a midpoint, right?
Yep.
So there's ways to understand that cost so you can use that. You should know what everything's costing you for that fire truck as much as you can and break that out. And I think that's one that's a lot of people don't think about. Oh, I'm getting a free dinner. Oh, no, you're not.
Yeah, you're not getting free dinner, and they're
You
not
paid
paying
for
for it.
everything.
You're paying for it. So again, if that's what's important, and you want that steak dinner or whatever, then that's fine. I mean, but you are paying for it at the end of the day. So again, if you're trying to save money, is it cheaper for me to fly out on my own, book my own tickets? They're charging you a base price that they know is going to cover the cost. Are you able to do it cheaper? It's hit or miss.
Pay for
Yeah, right?
instead.
Hey, we're not gonna have that steak dinner. We're gonna go to the convenience store and get them to make subs, or we'll order pizza or whatever for $50 a night for the entire committee, it's all based on your budget, and that is a spot in your budget where you can save a couple $1,000s, and that could be the difference in you upgrading something on your fire truck, or again, just the difference in you having, unfortunately, to hold a chicken barbecue for the next 10 years. That little change makes that difference up. But if you're not asking for that stuff up front, they're not telling you what that costs.
Some of the other things that, besides ladder truck stuff, which obviously I love to talk about, you mentioned the pump panel drawing, and not everybody provides that. And even when you ask for it, they may provide it, but it might cost money. You talked about the layout of things on the pump panel drawing, but if you do not ask for that, who designs the pump panel?
The
You kind
engineer,
of alluded.
the pump engineers would design a pump panel based on what they think works well. And it's well, I don't know. I've got pump panel drawings where I sent it back and said my 3-year-old could do better than this, um, from a very major manufacturer. And I'm not kidding when I said my 3-year-old could design his pump better than this person did. So, and then you get some back that look great. It depends. But you need to make your pump panel um, work for you. And stuff all over the place is not the way you want to go. You want to kind of have it set up however you like it. Front to back would be preferred, but in my world, but it's however you like it. And the other thing too is if you need it to match something else, you either need to, especially if you're changing manufacturers, you need to send them a picture and say this is what our pump panel needs to look like, or you need to say this pump panel needs to match, this previous apparatus that you've built for us. Because again, just because you think you're buying, I mean, we buy fleet trucks in Arlington, and you can buy 6 of them at a time, and all 6 of them are going to be somewhat different. As much as they're supposed to be exactly the same, they are not going to be exactly the same. Um, so you really have to pay attention, and again, specify that in the front. This pump panel has to match this pump panel. And same thing, if you are changing manufacturers, send them a picture. This is what our pump panel must look like, and do that early on, like before you sign a contract. This is what our pump panel has to look like. Because if they come back and say they can't do it for some reason, or then you got to again weigh what's important to you and make the decision. All right, we're not going to be able to go with you, or um, we'll accept that as it is, but know that then you have to go back and you know train everybody again on how to do something different. Every little change on your pump panel is another couple hours of training somewhere. So
That's exactly what I was going to say. Is that everything we've kind of talked about so far? The turn radius report, the even the ladder complement, the aerial loading, the load charts, pump panel layouts and drawings. All of that stuff goes back into what is going to happen when the rig comes in, and it goes back to that T word training, right? So, are you going to have to do more training? And not as that's a bad thing, right? Training is a great thing, but are you going to take away time, or you could be training on other topics to then go back to something that you spec in the fire truck? Is it
yeah,
worth it, right? And so what's that number of value? Again, making the informed decision. I know if I change XYZ on this fire truck, it might cost me $2,000, but for the next 20 years that this rig's in the fleet, it's going to save us time, energy, even the thought that somebody could get hurt or injured because we charged the wrong line, or didn't know where a discharge or an intake was, or confused something, right? So there's a lot more that goes into that than just does it match my other engine. It doesn't match my other engine to then ease training and help fluidity of operations to make sure that drivers can bounce back and forth between the rigs, or be able to help other people, other drivers if you're running multiple engines in a fleet. Other things to look at: load analysis. So when we look at load analysis,
hey, let's go back to
um,
pump panel because I want to tell a story.
okay.
Just like cut me on. No, no. I just saying, like, I know it's different now. I know it's different now. But when I was coming through training, like when I was probationary, like you had to be able to draw the pump panel from memory. Because again, that's if you could draw from memory, then I'm going to grab the right thing every time, and I know where the engine cooler is or the pump cooler. And oh, you want discharge number one pulled? Okay, I got it. It's 3 down. if I got a bunch of other stuff going on, I know where it is. So again, having that ability to move pump panel from this to this, it just it's already built in. And you talk about that training again. If I got to go back and learn a new pump panel, then and it's going to happen. Like, don't get me wrong, you're going to make changes. It's going to happen over time. But if we're building a repetitive or fire trucks, especially for a major or bigger fire department who's building them all the time, like we want to try to make that the same. But even if you've been driving the same fire truck for 20 years and then where everything is by feel, you really want their stuff as close as it can be, for the next 20 years too. So, all right, let's get on to your weight.
No, no, no. I think that was important. You're showing your age. The back in my day stories. I haven't heard many from you, so I think you're crossing over into the other side. It's
Yeah,
nice.
there's reasons for that.
Turning into a has been.
Hmm. I'm trying.
So load analysis, and I think that can go across a lot of things. We talk about specifically now electrical load. So there's obviously the weight load analysis, right? The weight review report that talks about the axles, making sure within weight, front to back, side to side. A lot of that stuff is somewhat given. You might have to ask for those. But other loads that we're concerned about are the electrical loads. So we want to do a draw analysis if we're getting a generator, right? Things that we would want to power to make sure we have a big enough generator, or we're not getting too big of a generator. As we've went from this, everything gets plugged into the fire truck to now everything's battery operated. We can now adjust that generator with again the right data and information, factually make those decisions. And then on the other side of that, an alternator, right, to make sure that with all of these things now going to battery, what's going to get charged off the rig, and can our alternator handle all of those loads? And I know that those reports exist, and I'm going to kick it over to Win so he can talk more about them because he's smarter about that stuff than
Yeah,
I
I think,
am.
I think a lot of that comes into play depending on what you're doing. I mean, if you're going to spec a 430 amp alternator, there's not much else you can do. And then today's new fire trucks are coming with two alternators, one specifically for their exhaust system. You can't do anything else with that alternator, but it's coming with it because it's got to be able to heat the exhaust up right away. But then you're going to have a second alternator that runs all of that stuff that you're talking about, all of that 12 volt, or the ability to recharge the batteries, and run all that stuff. So you need to look at the alternator that you're going to spec on there and run that load analysis. Is it? And especially, I think this really comes into play if you're buying, a stock unit, and hopefully they've done these load analysis when they designed it. But are you going to try to make any changes to this thing to where you've now overloaded the the alternator that they put on there? Again, if you're putting a 430 amp alternator on it, you're probably going to be okay. But if you're down in the 320 amp alternator, or you're running a commercial fire truck as your pumper, that's where you could potentially see issues with what you want to do with that stuff. So it becomes important to look at that. And then the other thing too is to understand that an alternator, they're always going to tell you the high end of the alternator, but you got to realize that that's with the high idle one or the fast idle one. So what does the alternator run at when the fast idle's not on? And how does that factor into trying to because all we don't have the fast idle on all the time. If we're pumping, the fast idle's not on. Sometimes it just depends on what the pump's set at. So again, it's a little bit of an offset there with that, but you want to make sure that you look at it all. Um, and again, everybody, hopefully the manufacturers are running this for you, but we've seen it time and time again where you've been over on your amp draws for the alternators. Same thing with the generators. You're over the amp draw on the generator. Now maybe that's okay. Maybe you don't plan on running every scene light and four cord reels at the same time. But potentially that could be an issue. And if you don't understand it, you're going to start tripping breakers and things like that. Um, so you want to know that. The other thing too, with the last NFPA change, is that your battery charger has to be able to charge everything that you have directly hooked to the batteries, including the battery when it's back in the firehouse. So, if you're direct, if you want to back into the firehouse and have your flashlights charging constantly all the time off of your 12 volt system, then that amp draw has to be factored into the charger that they're going to put on there. If you don't tell them, and even if you do tell them, hey, we're going to charge 6 batteries that are pulling 2 amps a piece, so 12 amps, and we're going to have it hooked to a 20 amp circuit. If you don't tell them, the goal would be to tell them that this is what we're charging, and they say, all right, this circuit's only going to take 12 amps, but we're putting a 20 amp fuse block on here, then they're going to take 20 amps, and that's 20 amps of your 60 or 40 amp battery charger that you already put on it. That now you're starting to overload that too. So there's even an extra, set of numbers that you want to look at now too to make sure that the battery charger we're putting on the fire truck has the ability to charge everything as well. Do we need to move stuff over to where it only charges when it's plugged into the shoreline? Things like that as you start to wire those fire trucks up.
Yeah, I think there's a big swing that's been going either way, just like the fire service normally does. Everyone was all about the 12-volt stuff, and they started going way over that way. And now they're starting to go back to generators a little bit and kind of relaxing how they're charging things. There's so many things that are battery powered. We can't charge them all the time on a whim. We have to start really looking at what needs to be charged when and how it's going to be charged, right? And there's some generators that are kind of coming back into play, and even light towers you could do off of a 12-volt system, but maybe they're going back on the generator just because of all that draw and everything else. I mean, some of these batteries are getting zapped pretty quick or not charging all the way. Computers in the fire truck, you start going to MDTs and radios and all the other stuff that draws off the battery. You can get into a pretty, I know a lot of Chiefs cars, swing that way where one battery, even two, there's a lot of issues where they're dying or because of the draw from the
And again, that
computers.
goes into knowing what you're putting in this fire truck and telling them up front. If you don't tell them we're putting an MDT in here, or we have to put all this computer stuff in here, then they're not going to factor that in, and they're not going to be able to help you with that. I'm looking at an alternator chart right here, and the output amps is 430, but at idle, which is where it's probably going to run most of the time, it's somewhere between 240 and 270 amps, depending on how hot the engine is. So, again,
Wow.
understanding that drop and that difference of where it runs versus what it's rated at becomes important as you try to figure that stuff out. Another thing, like another thing to look at, and especially now as we transition motors, is a lot of people were afraid to go with the L9s, or they're afraid to go with the X10s, um, and they want to go with the bigger X12s or X15s. But I mean, when you talk about going to that bigger motor, you are talking about, especially with the exhaust packages that are coming today, you're talking about some big changes. Um, so not only in the way the apparatus is built, and what potentially could be sight lines or space in the fire truck, height wise, length wise in the cab, things like that. You're also talking about thousands and thousands of dollars between a small motor and a big motor. And you really need to try to figure out, just because you think the big motors might always be better, like you need to figure out whether that's true. And the same thing goes with transmissions as well. Is do I need a 4,000 or a 45 or a 3,000 or a 35? Really a close gear or a wide gear transmission, is you can run or scans for that. So a motor scan or a transmission scan, and you can see how the engine is going to perform with all of that factors in there. So if you want to know how a 565 motor versus a 605 motor is going to perform with a 4,000 EVS transmission, ask for that. Again, those things can be run in seconds, and you can look down and see, hey, this thing's only going to save me 2 seconds and 100 feet from 0 to 60. So is it worth it? And again, if I'm pulling hills, what speed will, or what motor helps me on these hills better if it's constant? And then again, is the extra 4 miles an hour up the hill going to really make a big difference? Is it going to make a $60,000-$70,000 difference in the cost of your fire truck? And that's just the cost of the motor. Remember, when we increase motor size, we increase weight. So now we've potentially increased the front axle, the rear axle, tires, all of that stuff, brake sizes, or brake, maybe not sizes, but brake wear. So, again, is that 4 second difference, or 4 miles an hour, depending on what you're looking at, is it worth it? Is it worth it? But without that information, how do you make that?
Right. I think now we talk about room in the cab too. I mean, that's kind of coming back in the conversation. Is there going to be some sort of a jut out? Is the wheelbase going to be compromised because the bigger motor requires a
Well,
bigger
yeah, I mean
clearance?
the second alternator is already going to increase the size of the motor tunnel on almost every fire truck. I don't think anybody really knows yet from the last I've heard. They're still trying to figure all that out. They got less than a year now to do that, but you're going to lose space. That's what I'm saying. Either the tunnel's going to go higher so the driver can't see across, or um, it's going to go wider, or it's going to force the entire cab to go wider. If you are in a 96-inch cab, it might not work anymore. You might be bumped to a 98-inch cab, and I think that's what some manufacturers are finding out. The engine tunnel could be longer, so if you have forward-facing seats in the rear, that gap between your feet and the engine box could shrink up now to where you can barely put your feet in there. So, again, I think you're going to see changes that, um, again, you want to be able to make that decision. Do I need this bigger motor for what we need to do in our first do? I mean, if you're relatively flat, if you're not pulling hills, and again, if you're pulling hills, is you know 4 miles an hour up the hill, how long up that hill do you have to go? Is it worthwhile? They're equal. They seem to be equal at the top and the bottom. It's in the middle where you start to see a little bit of a change, but is that change worth it?
Right, making those informed decisions. As I hear you talking, and take a zoom out look of what we've talked about in this podcast already. You start saying, all right, well, let's get a weight analysis report. Now we have marginal axles where we need to maybe bump up those axles. Now bumping up that axle affects our cramp angle, which is going to affect our turning radius. Right, bigger motor might increase our wheelbase, which affects our turning radius again. Now our weight front to back is a little off, so now we have to figure out where we're going to put equipment, or the equipment that we wanted to carry, we might be a little bit more limited now. Where if we're going to put all this, EMS equipment or RTF, ballistic equipment in the front, there's less storage space, and now there's more weight. So now we're going to put more weight on the front axle than we originally anticipated, and now the cab's going to get a little bit more cramped. So now we need a bigger cab, right? So all of these decisions start snowballing, and there's been a lot of talk about that a little bit more recently because of this motor, and there's so many unknowns. But that's why you get all these reports. If you can get the engine scan, and you can get the turning radius report, and you can get the weight analysis for those two different motor types and transmission types, you can look at all of those facts now, and you can make an informed decision. Not, I just want to get the bigger motor, and you're not even paying attention to the other stuff of how it affected your vehicle. You can't, now you go back into the firehouse, and making the turn out of the firehouse becomes a pain in the neck. And although it's the fastest thing in the world, again, go back to turning radius report, something that you brought up earlier that even I learned, right? Speed for turning radius report. You might be able to go 100 miles an hour in this fire truck, which is silly, but whatever. Maybe you want to do that, but your turning radius report is so pitiful. And now the turning radius report was done at 2 miles an hour, and at the 100 miles an hour that you can go now, it doesn't turn at all.
Well,
So
not
now
only
you have to
that,
slow down
not
even
only
more.
that, NFPA has speed limit ratings based on the overall the gross vehicle weight of the fire truck. So, are you now signing off an NFPA waiver that you're going to let this fire truck go faster than it should? And then, along with that, the tires have speed ratings on them as well. So, are you now putting a tire on that has to be fire service, rated, which is probably fine for a majority of us. It depends on the runs that you're doing. But if you're increasing the speed of your fire truck to 75 miles an hour because you can, do your tires match that speed that you've put on there? So again, it's this big snowball, kind of thing. If we make this one change, and we made one of the last pre-cons I went on. One of the notes that came back from engineering was, and I forget exactly what it was, but I think the front axle was relatively way overweight. Not overweight, it was too heavy for the apparatus that was being built. But a change through the conversations was they didn't change the amount of water they were carrying, but they changed the position of the water tank to get the hose bed lower. So the water tank got pushed further to the front, which we were already running new weight ratings because we had talked about decreasing the size of the front axle to get that weight, so we don't have this bad ride. But as we did that, we said, hey, we got to run another weight report. And when we ran that next weight report with the water shifted forward, we needed that heavier axle. So, again, this isn't we're trying to talk about things that aren't standard or that you might want to request before you even sign a contract, but you have to continue to any changes that you make throughout the process of your fire truck, you have to make sure you reevaluate these things to make sure that you're not hurting yourself by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we weren't sure how long this would take to talk about, but I think this subject is so vast of how everything affects each other, but also when you get, I mean, I know, even going to the simpler fact of asking for things, we've kind of dipped our toes into the water a little bit, but the three parts of a major spec, right? You have the big drawing that, that is nice and pretty. They sketch it out, and, firefighters, you can use their crayon and highlight. And because we like to see the drawing, that's how most people look at fire trucks. And when you sign a contract, that's what everyone posts on Facebook. That's the most readily available thing to look at what a fire truck's going to look like. We're visual, we can see it. The second part is that component list, the stripper, what I like to refer to as a table of contents, right? Tells you basically how many of what you're going to get. And that's how they charge you the money. That's like your receipt, basically. And I call it the table of contents because it tells you the what, but it doesn't tell you the how or the where all the time. And so that third most important piece is that full written spec, the long verbiage. And I talked about it. I was just in Missouri for Missouri Winter Fire School. It's a local conference out there by University of Missouri Fire Service Extension, and my man Tracy out there does a phenomenal show. And when we're out there talking about it, just showing some of those guys who's seen a drawing, everyone raised their hand, yeah, and they start going, oh, who's seen the stripper? Maybe a couple fewer hands, and who's seen the long verbiage, and maybe one hand would raise up, and you start looking at what the drawing shows, what the stripper shows, or that components list, and then you read the long verbiage spec, and there's three different things, right? That long verbiage gives that little extra detail to show exactly how or where they're going to do what they say they're giving you, right? I'm giving you a scene light. You're getting two of them. That's great. But I'm going to tilt it. It's going to be 6 inches away from the edge of the cab at a 4-degree angle down. It's going to point here. It's going to have this many lumens with this mix of a light with a white housing. None of that stuff shown anywhere else. The picture shows a light, but it doesn't necessarily say where or how it's going to get mounted on there. And so I think that's another big important thing is you're looking at specs. And now I can start going apples to apples a little bit, right? When we have an issue out at pre-engineering or final inspection, now we can say, hey, why is this light like this? That long verbiage is going to tell you that's what it was meant to do, or that's what they told you they were going to do with that light. So I think that's another big piece of this of having all of the materials out there, going and inspecting the fire truck. Now you're the most informed you can possibly be. Every decision you make, you get all those documents kind of updated. And then once the vehicle's finalized, you take those documents, put them in a folder, and now the next spec or the next rig you go to do, now you have something to reference. Hey, we liked this, we did not like this. I need to change, these 10 things. These are the 5 things that really worked out well. They cannot change at all. And now when we get this new spec, you might say, hey, copy this thing exactly. And I'll give you, for instance, College Park, we did the water can in the cab on the outside of the vehicle with the 2 hooks. That was like one of the first cabs that they had done that with that particular cab design. And so we have all these 3D drawings and stuff like that in our folder of how it was going to kind of come out and how it was going to work. And that was great. And we've copied that on Arlington truck specs now. And the other day I was out in Station 6 in the truck that was just delivered, and the can mount is not deep enough. So now the can has a little bit more flop and a little bit, if you brake hard or make a hard turn, the hooks on the outside are holding the can in more. Well, it was an exact copy of what College Park did, what now 10 years ago when we spec'd it. And it just has not translated exactly the same. So that long verbiage spec there, we could compare those two side by side and see what those dimensions are actually supposed to be, and they're probably not going to be the same thing anymore. So though you've copied an additional truck or copied the same thing, now we can go down there and dig deeper and see that that wasn't actually meeting what we needed to meet. So now for us on our side, when we go to spec that again, if that's a possibility, one of the things we need to do now is specify a certain depth of that compartment or depth of that can tube to hold that water can down lower so that it's actually retained in that spot better than it is currently now. And again, you can go spec a fire truck tomorrow. And that old, the old adage that Tom Shan had said, right? It can fit on the sheet of paper and it can look pretty, but it doesn't actually mean it's going to fit your needs. And so I think that's where that customization comes in. There's a lot of flashy things out there that people do that don't always necessarily work out or have the right intention. And you take a stock unit that you had no say in the beginning and start making these little changes, there's these cascading effects that now you don't really have any control over. So starting from the ground and working up is a ton of work. It is a lot of work to build a fire truck from the ground up, but it's so rewarding when you're able to knock those things, as little details out of the park that make operations just that much better and easier and safer, right? Because that's at the end of the day what we're kind of here for, is to make these things safer.
Right. Yeah.
So
Well, I don't have anything else on my list for things that might not be standard or that we want to ask for, and I don't think we should get into the other stuff at this point. I think
no.
you were so long winded that we can shut it down.
Listen, I tell one story, all of a sudden it's game over now. Now, I was on my soapbox quite a bit. But I think for this, to close this out, I'll get on my soapbox again and just, talk the day away. No, but I think this applies to everybody, right? We talked about this in the beginning. If you're before signing a contract, there's a lot of things in here that are important. If you're waiting for pre-engineering, you're in that, year or two time frame or a couple months time frame, depending on who you signed with and how they're laying that out. For your pre-engineering, this is a great time to ask for some of this
Right.
stuff.
It's
And
not
again, it
too
might
late.
cost you. Right. Yeah, it's not too late. Right. And if you're ready for final inspection, it's still not a bad time when you're going out there for final to ask for some of this stuff, because it'll be so helpful on the next rig, right? You may not be here anymore. You may not be on that next committee. But I can tell you from somebody that's no longer on an apparatus committee at College Park to when I did spec the truck, it was so nice to hand a huge folder of a whole crap ton of information over to somebody else so they have a great starting point and you have really good notes for meetings and all these different things, and they can reach out with a very specific question now. Hey, why did it go from here to here? I saw on the final spec versus the midway spec. Here's the change order or this piece of paper of things that you changed, or notes from pre-engineering. Why did you guys make that decision? And then we can have that conversation like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. We were going to change it back, but now because you said XYZ, we're not, because that makes more sense of why you guys made that choice. So I think that all of this stuff becomes very important when specing a fire truck. So definitely get it all. Doesn't matter where you're at in the process.
Right. Yeah. I don't have anything else to add. That's pretty good.
You don't have any back in my day stories?
No, I'm not. No.
I guess you're one and done. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate everybody joining in for this podcast again. Again, any feedback, any questions you guys or gals have, reach out. Any suggestions for future podcasts or something you think we should talk about more, please reach out. Email address Nick, Wilbur, Wilbur, at evr.solutions. And if you like this podcast and you're a first time listener, go to Fire Apparatus Emergency Equipment. Check out podcasts and look for the Apparatus Workshop page. We have a ton of other podcasts to check out. A good resource of information, and Fire Apparatus Emergency Equipment has a ton of information about spec and fire trucks too, to check out to help you on your journey. Be safe out there, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.